Racism often hides in plain sight, but in one small American town, that quiet truth was shattered in a single afternoon. What began as an attempt to intimidate an elderly black woman in a local diner would spark a chain of events that shook the town to its core. None of the men who targeted her could have known that the woman they mocked was a retired military strategist with decades of experience, and that one phone call would bring her past roaring back. Before they understood what they'd started, the ground beneath them had shifted, old alliances had fractured, and a silent town began to find its voice. This isn't just a story about a veteran standing her ground. It's about how one woman's quiet defiance became the catalyst for a reckoning and proved that courage doesn't weaken with age, and justice answers when called. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The bell above the door gave a single chime as Esther Jenkins stepped into the diner. Its worn leather booths and faded linoleum floors soaked in the kind of silence that said more than any greeting could. She moved with measured grace, her steps neither hurried nor slow, her presence unobtrusive yet undeniable, as though the very air had grown still in response to her arrival. She wore a pressed navy blouse, buttoned clean to the top, and a gray wool coat that hung neatly off her shoulders. Her silver locket, polished to a soft gleam, rested against her chest, like a quiet testament to everything she had endured and never spoken aloud. As she made her way to the long counter beneath the row of flickering pendant lights, the hum of conversation dipped, not fully dying but retracting in that familiar way, words clinging to throats instead of floating free. Esther did not react to the pause, nor to the subtle scrape of boots against tile or the way a man 2 booths over shifted his weight just enough to turn his back toward her. She had known this atmosphere before, in 1,000 variations of the same cold welcome. She understood it without needing to name it. Choosing the last stool near the window, she sat with careful precision, smoothing her skirt as she settled in, her posture straight but not stiff, her eyes soft but alert. The waitress, a pale young woman with a nervous mouth and a fraying apron, took a moment too long to approach, her order pad trembling slightly in her hand. Her glance darted toward the kitchen before she forced a tight smile and asked, almost whispering, what Esther would like to drink. Esther offered a nod, her voice low and clear, requesting tea. Nothing more, just tea, if they had lemon. The waitress shook her head, but offered sugar instead, to which Esther replied with a polite nod of acceptance, neither surprised nor disappointed. As the young woman walked away, her pace quickening with each step, Esther folded her hands on the counter and looked out through the window, where the morning light broke through the blinds in thin, uneven stripes that cast long shadows across the formica. The room behind her returned to motion, but not warmth. Every shift of a plate, every cough or scrape of silverware seemed louder than it should have been, as if the sound itself carried weight. Though no one spoke to her directly, Esther could feel the glances land and linger. She did not need to look to know that her presence had unsettled a space that was not used to being unsettled, that her quiet defiance of some unspoken rule had set something simmering just beneath the surface. Her tea arrived in a chipped mug without a saucer, the string of the tea bag still clinging to the rim. She stirred in the sugar slowly, watching the steam curl upward, breathing in the faint scent of oversteeped leaves. There was no rush in her movements, no sign that she had noticed the weight of the stairs or the tightening of voices around her. She took a sip, set the mug down gently, and reached into her handbag to pull out a small paperback, its spine softened from years of careful reading. She laid it beside her tea but did not open it. The man sitting a few stools away adjusted his position, not to make room, but to make his presence known. His elbow nudged outward, his eyes flicking toward her. And though he said nothing, the message was clear in the way he refused to look away, even as she continued sipping her tea with quiet composure. Esther did not acknowledge him. She simply exhaled through her nose and shifted slightly in her seat, her hand still resting lightly on the locket that never left her neck. The waitress had vanished into the back, and the cook, a heavy-set man with arms like ham hocks, pretended to busy himself with the grill, though his eyes flickered up every few moments, meeting hers only once before dropping back to the grease-stained spatula he scrubbed against the skillet. The radio crackled softly above the counter, playing an old country tune that spoke of heartbreak and long roads, the lyrics barely audible beneath the rising tide of tension that had begun to gather in the corners of the room. Then came the sound that shifted the mood entirely. The bell above the door rang again, sharper this time, more intrusive, as though it had been pushed with intention rather than passivity. Heavy boots struck the tile floor with rhythmic finality, and a hush fell over the diner that had nothing to do with politeness. Caleb Riggins stepped through the doorway, with two men flanking him, their denim jackets faded and stiff with wear, their eyes already scanning the room like they owned every inch of it. Caleb removed his sunglasses slowly, tucking them into the front pocket of his shirt, before rolling his shoulders back and letting his gaze sweep across the booths. His smirk arrived before he spoke, curling across his face with the lazy satisfaction of someone who believed the world still bent beneath him. His eyes landed on Esther with a flicker of recognition, though not from familiarity. Just that particular kind of offense some men took at the sight of someone who did not look afraid. He leaned slightly toward his friend Red, murmuring something that made the larger man laugh under his breath. The sound not quite loud, but more than loud enough to be heard. The third man, younger than the others but with the same posture of entitlement, stood near the door with his arms crossed, chewing on a toothpick as he stared openly at Esther like she were a painting that didn't belong on the wall. Esther, still seated with her tea, did not turn around. Her hands remained on the mug, and her gaze never strayed from the window. But her body, still and composed, tensed just slightly. A breath caught in her chest, as though she had just felt the first drop of rain before a storm. They had seen her now, and they were not going to leave her alone. Esther sipped her tea without rush, her hands still wrapped around the warm ceramic as the gang lingered just inside the doorway, their laughter stretching long and aimless, like smoke looking for something to choke. Caleb took his time, his boots scuffing deliberately against the floor as he strolled along the row of booths, eyes dragging across the customers with casual arrogance. But there was only one person in that diner he had come to focus on. She hadn't moved since they entered, hadn't flinched or looked back, and somehow that unsettled him more than if she had. He nudged Red with a flick of his chin, and the larger man chuckled under his breath, the kind of chuckle that sounded practiced, like it had always come before something worse. Caleb drew closer to the counter, placing a hand flat on it, right where the waitress had left the checkbook and a half-empty pot of coffee. He looked at Esther without hiding it now, his voice lifting just enough for the rest of the diner to hear. "You know, it's a funny thing," he began, eyes gleaming with a smug kind of ease, "how folks just wander into places like they've got some kind of claim, like they belong." Esther didn't look up. Caleb waited a beat, perhaps expecting her to blink or shift in her seat. When she didn't, he leaned in slightly, his knuckles tapping the counter just beside her mug. "Most people around here understand the way things are. They know what fits and what don't." Still, Esther said nothing. She reached for her sugar packet and quietly poured a second one into her tea. The motion was calm, careful, unbothered. "Guess when you get to be a certain age, you stop remembering what a line looks like," Caleb said, his voice now tinged with mock sympathy. "Or maybe you just think it don't apply anymore." A few of the other customers shifted in their booths. One man glanced at the door like he might leave, but stayed seated, turning his coffee cup in slow circles. No one spoke, no one interrupted. Esther stirred her tea with the small wooden stick, letting the silence settle again. It stretched long enough that Caleb seemed to grow irritated by it, as if the absence of reaction wounded his performance. Red stepped forward and scratched the back of his neck, grinning with a kind of childish delight. "She probably thinks we're scared of her," he said, looking past her toward the cook, who remained hunched over the grill, eyes lowered as if hoping to disappear behind a row of sizzling bacon. "She probably thinks this place is one of them feel-good cities you read about in the news," Caleb added, straightening now, his tone darker. "The kind where people just let anyone sit wherever they want. Like history didn't matter." He circled slowly, not too close, but enough to make his presence felt. The third man, younger than the rest, leaned on the back of a booth and scratched his jaw, watching with idle amusement. "Tell me something, Grandma," Caleb said, dropping the pretense of politeness entirely. "You lose your way off the highway, or you just like making people uncomfortable?" Esther took one last sip of her tea, then gently placed the mug down with both hands. Her voice, when it came, was low, but carried like music does in a still room. "Do I look uncomfortable to you?" Her tone held no edge, no challenge, just calm certainty that stripped the smirk from Caleb's face quicker than any threat might have. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, caught off guard by her poise. She turned just enough to glance at him over her shoulder, her expression unreadable, steady. "I was raised on porches, where men like you didn't speak, unless they were spoken to," she added, her voice measured and cool. "And they didn't lean over women while they drank their tea." A low whistle came from the young man by the booth, and Red let out a dry cough that was half a laugh. "She's got spunk," Red muttered, though his smile was souring. "Ain't nobody taught her when to hush." Esther turned back to her tea and adjusted the book beside it without opening it. Her fingers lingered on the cover, as if to say she had better things to do than trade words with men who thrived on being loud. Caleb stepped back, rubbing his jaw like he was weighing something heavier than pride. "Must be real easy to act high and mighty when you know nobody here's gonna touch you," he said, voice dropping lower. "Because we're polite like that. Because we've got respect for age." He paused, then added with a sneer, "But respect's got to be earned. Not just handed over because somebody lived long enough to turn gray." A moment passed. Esther's hand returned to the mug, lifting it gently, sipping without trembling. "Gray," she said softly, "wasn't given to me either. I earned every strand." The room stayed quiet. More so now, not from fear, but from something shifting, something harder to name. Caleb's eyes narrowed. He didn't understand what it was that unnerved him about her calm, only that it gnawed at something he wasn't used to having challenged. He looked around the room. No one dared look him in the eye. Not the man near the jukebox. Not the cook. Not even the waitress peeking from the kitchen doorway. "You're not welcome here, ma'am," Caleb said finally, pressing the word like a stone. "Some places just ain't meant for certain people." Esther didn't move. Her silence now wasn't submission. It was dismissal. Caleb clenched his jaw. He turned to Red, who shrugged, clearly ready to escalate. The tension coiled tighter as the men stepped forward again, their amusement beginning to sour into frustration. And still, no one said a word to stop them. The air in the diner had grown thick, heavy like it was waiting to break. Esther remained still, her hands resting gently around the rim of the mug, though the warmth had long since faded. She hadn't taken another sip since her last quiet reply, but her fingers remained there as if tethered to the calm she refused to surrender. Her spine stayed straight, her chin lifted with the quiet dignity of someone who had stood in worse rooms than this and walked out of them unbroken. But pride, especially the pride of small men, was not something that endured being outshone, not by a woman, and certainly not by one who bore every mark of what they had spent their lives despising. The laughter that had once accompanied their jeers had thinned to something more dangerous now. Not boisterous, but brittle, as if the silence that clung to the room was daring one of them to make the first crack. Caleb moved first. He stepped closer to the counter, slow at first, but with the controlled gait of someone trying not to appear angry, though his nostrils flared just slightly, and the skin around his jaw had tightened. "You sure do have a mouth on you for someone who got invited to exactly nowhere," he said, his voice low and bitter, each word dropped like a coin with rusted edges. You think folks are supposed to care what you've been through just 'cause you've got wrinkles? He didn't wait for an answer. He didn't want one. Red followed behind him, arms crossed over his chest, and the third man flanked the other side of the counter, boxing her in with presence alone. There was space still, but not enough to ignore the closeness. Esther lifted her eyes just once, meeting Caleb's gaze. Not with defiance, not with anger, but with a gaze so calm, so rooted, it struck deeper than any insult she could have thrown. And that, more than anything she had said before, cut through him. Something in his face shifted. A flicker of humiliation disguised poorly as rage. The diner was silent. The clink of dishes had stopped entirely. The cook no longer pretended to clean the grill. The waitress had not returned from the back. Caleb reached across the counter. His hand brushed against the mug, as if by accident at first, knocking it slightly so that a small trail of lukewarm tea spilled across the counter's surface. Esther moved her hand to steady it, her fingers curling gently around the rim. "Careful," she said, her voice no louder than before, but Caleb's fingers pressed harder. With one sharp movement, he slapped the mug from beneath her hand. The ceramic hit the floor with a crack that echoed like a slap across the room. He splashed against the tile, brown and sticky, shards skidding in different directions. The room froze. The shatter seemed to hang in the air long after the mug had broken. Esther's hand stayed in the air a moment longer before it returned slowly to the counter. Her eyes didn't rise. Her shoulders didn't tense. But the dignity in her stillness had dimmed. Not from fear, but from being forced to remember something she thought she had earned the right to forget. Red snorted behind Caleb, as if proud of the damage. The youngest one chuckled, nudging a shard with the toe of his boot. "She broke it," Red said to no one in particular, though his voice carried easily. "Ain't got no grip left." "Guess age does that." Esther lowered her gaze to the tea running across the tile toward her shoes. She pulled her bag into her lap quietly and began brushing a few drops of tea from her skirt with slow, deliberate fingers. The locket around her neck swung gently, catching the light just once before stilling again. Caleb leaned forward, his hand pressing against the counter as he brought his face closer to hers. "You sit there like you got the right to speak above us," he said, voice low but shaking now. "You don't. Not here. You're not owed anything." Esther didn't respond immediately. She reached for a napkin and pressed it gently to the wet ring the mug had left on the counter, folding it with care. Then she looked up, not rushed, not harsh, just steady. Her voice was low, each syllable measured like a toll being collected. "You think breaking that cup broke me?" she asked, nodding slightly toward the floor. "You boys don't know the first thing about breaking someone. I've buried husbands and held dying soldiers in my arms. I've walked through towns with fire behind me and rifles in front. And you think I'm going to blink over a cup of tea?" The silence thickened. Caleb stared at her, mouth slightly open, unsure if it was anger or confusion pressing at his throat. Esther stood then, slow and quiet, the kind of rise that didn't need noise to make it known. She pulled her coat around her shoulders and picked up her handbag. Her fingers moved to the locket and closed around it, her thumb tracing its edge. "I came here for peace. You should have let me have it." She let the words hang for a breath, then leaned just slightly forward, not in aggression, but in finality. "You won't see me again until it's already too late." With that, she turned and walked past them, each step deliberate and unshaken, not hurried, but unyielding. The men parted enough to let her pass, more from surprise than fear, but none of them moved to stop her. She walked out the front door without a word more. The bell jingled behind her, the sound sharp in the silent diner. Outside, the sky was the color of unturned soil, dark and heavy with the quiet weight of something that had not yet begun, but was already felt in the wind. A slow gust curled through the empty parking lot, lifting the hem of Esther's coat. As she moved toward the bench beneath the great oak tree, where the roots pushed up through the earth like the bones of an old body that had never quite rested. She sat down with care, her movements steady despite the trembling that had started in her fingers, not from fear, but from the pressure of memory pushing forward after too many years held still. From her bag, she drew a cloth-wrapped object she hadn't touched in over a decade. Unfolding the faded fabric with delicate precision, she revealed an old flip phone, battered along the edges, the plastic dulled from time, but the keys still firm beneath her fingers. It had been waiting in silence for this moment, buried deep beneath receipts, peppermints, and the habits of peace. She opened it, the screen lighting up weakly in the dusky shade, and pressed the single number still programmed into its speed dial. It rang once, then again, before a voice answered. Rough, low, and marked with that unmistakable weight of age, command, and familiarity. "Esther, they think I'm alone," she said softly, her voice as steady as her heartbeat, though every word carried the weight of a signal flare. They forgot what silence can wake. There was no hesitation. The voice replied, not with concern, but with readiness born from a long slumbering instinct. 15 minutes. She closed the phone, wrapped it again, and tucked it back into the bag. She didn't rise right away. She simply sat for a moment beneath the sprawling limbs of the tree that had watched her come and go from this town for longer than any of them inside had been alive. She breathed deeply, drawing in the scent of dry bark and distant honeysuckle, then exhaled with a calm that had taken years to cultivate and only seconds to reclaim. Inside the diner, the laughter had returned. It rose louder now, bold and self-assured, shaped by the kind of ignorance that mistook silence for surrender and age for weakness. Caleb held court from his booth, retelling the moment with a theatrical swagger that distorted the truth, even as it fueled his pride. Red leaned back with one arm stretched across the seat, chewing a toothpick between his teeth, while tossing out offhand comments meant to amuse, but only exposed something uglier beneath his grin. The third man, still barely past his 20s, mimicked Esther's quiet voice in mockery, drawing chuckles from a few of the patrons who remained unwilling to look toward the front windows, where the last streaks of light were beginning to fade into something colder. None of them noticed the approach of the vehicle, old and dust-covered, its engine humming low with the muted determination of something that did not need to announce itself to be recognized. The pickup slowed to a crawl near the lot, headlights off. The windows tinted just enough to keep the town from seeing who was inside, until it was far too late to ask questions. The passenger door opened first, followed by the driver's side, and then the back doors, each one swinging wide with a steady rhythm, as if timed to the slow roll of thunder that had begun gathering far beyond the tree line. Walter "Buck" Reynolds was the first to step out. He stood tall despite the age in his joints, his frame broad beneath the wool coat that had seen more countries than most of the men inside had seen counties. He held his cane in one hand, not as a crutch, but as a tool of purpose, the tip striking the concrete in a clean, deliberate cadence that echoed faintly through the air. His eyes swept across the diner's lit windows, taking in the silhouettes moving beyond the glass with the detached focus of a man counting targets, not people. Next came Luther Daniels, quieter in presence, but no less grounded. He adjusted the strap of his old radio satchel and fell into step behind Buck without a word, his gaze narrowed and scanning, already reading the angles of entry and escape. His fingers tapped once against the canvas flap, a habit from long ago, a message that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Gladys Scott followed, her scarf tied neatly beneath her chin, her hair still pressed with pride, and her posture as sharp as it had been the day she'd first put on a medic's uniform. In one pocket of her coat rested the tin of peppermints she always carried, and in the other, a pair of brass knuckles she had never once needed to polish. She moved with a limp now, the result of a fractured leg that had never healed quite right. But every step was sure, every motion balanced by a will that had never dulled. Samir Holmes, towering and silent, brought up the rear. His hands were bare despite the chill, knuckles scarred and thick, and his eyes carried the quiet focus of a man who had known violence well enough to walk through it without noise. He carried no bag, no extra weight, only the long, slow breath of someone who had come ready for whatever was waiting. They crossed the parking lot as one, not in formation, but in a rhythm that had never left them. The bell above the diner door rang with the same tired chime that had greeted Esther, but now it rang like the toll of something final. The moment they stepped inside, the air shifted again. It didn't crash or break. It compressed. The laughter from the booth stopped mid-breath. Red's toothpick dropped to the floor. The youngest of them blinked, his grin faltering. Caleb looked up and found himself staring into a silence more commanding than any shout could have ever been. Esther stood in the doorway behind them, her hands still clasped around her bag, her face unreadable beneath the soft light. She did not speak. She didn't need to. The men who had just entered spoke in the way they stood, in the way they looked without blinking, in the weight of their presence which said, without question, that this place no longer belonged to those who had claimed it through fear. Buck walked to the center of the diner, resting one hand lightly against the counter. His cane tapped once against the baseboard, just enough to remind the floor who was now standing on it. He looked at Caleb, not with anger, not with hatred, but with the same quiet certainty Esther had shown hours earlier. "You touched our sister's tea," Buck said, his voice calm but thunder low. A reminder rather than an accusation. "So now you'll answer to her family." Caleb stood slowly, his mouth parted as if words might come, but none did. Behind him, Red began to rise, but Samir was already a step closer, arms crossed, eyes fixed on his. Esther remained where she was, letting the moment stretch long enough for its weight to settle over every corner of the room. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just waited. Because this wasn't about payback. It was about memory. And memory had finally come home. The silence inside the diner tightened until it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The veterans stood quietly, their feet planted, their eyes calm, but the air around them had changed. Something electric and ancient, now stretching through the tiled floor, through the warped tables and overhead lights. Caleb shifted uneasily beside his booth, his fingers twitching against the laminated edge of the table, though he made no move to sit down or step forward. His eyes moved from Buck's cane to Samir's broad shoulders, to the way Gladys never stopped watching his hands. Then Red laughed. It was sharp, nasal, a sound that bounced against the windows and rang false even to those who might have shared his pride minutes before. "Well, look what we got here," he said, leaning back against the booth with his arms folded across his chest. "A little retirement party showed up. That it? Y'all forget what year it is?" The younger man with the slicked-back hair snorted behind him, nodding toward Esther. "They look like they came straight out of a museum. What you gonna do? Teach us a history lesson?" Caleb smirked, finding comfort in the sound of his people again. "You sure you don't want to sit down before you break a hip? This ain't bingo night, old man." Buck's face didn't change. He adjusted the grip on his cane just slightly, letting the curved handle turn in his palm until the tip faced forward. Samir said nothing. His hands remained loose at his sides, but his feet shifted almost imperceptibly, just enough to change his stance, just enough to begin. "They've still got their Sunday shoes on," Red muttered, clearly emboldened now, "probably gonna throw teacups at us." Gladys finally moved. Not much. Just a half-step forward, one hand slipping into her coat pocket, her peppermint tin rattling faintly before her fingers closed around something harder, heavier. Her mouth curled just slightly, not into a smile, but something colder. "I buried men younger than you," she said quietly, her eyes locking onto Red's, "and I did it without spilling a drop of tea." The room held for a beat, a single second of tension so thick It seemed like even the dust in the air paused. Then Red moved. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't lunge or shout. It was a shift, a twitch of the hand toward his belt, a pivot of the hip as he stepped forward, maybe thinking he could knock the cane from Buck's hand or shove Luther aside. But that was all the veterans needed. Samir was the first to strike, moving with a speed that betrayed the stillness he had held all along. His leg swept outward, catching Red's ankle and pulling it out from under him just as Buck stepped in, driving the tip of his cane, not as a walking aid, but as a weapon, into Red's knee with a heavy crack that sent the larger man sprawling backward into a booth. Gladys pivoted cleanly, her right hand swinging in a wide, efficient arc that brought her brass knuckles crashing into the side of the youngest gang member's face before he had time to react. He crumpled against the counter with a loud thud, knocking over a tray of silverware that scattered across the tile like thrown coins. Caleb barely had time to move before Luther was on him, his forearm locking tight across the man's neck, driving him backward into the booth with practiced weight. The table shifted violently under their struggle, and 2 ketchup bottles fell to the floor and rolled beneath the stools. The waitress screamed from the back hallway, but didn't return. The cook, still frozen behind the grill, ducked low, too stunned or too cowardly to intervene. Esther remained at the door. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply watched. Buck spun as Red tried to rise, gripping the edge of the booth for leverage, his face twisted in shock and pain. Without hesitation, Buck brought the cane around in a clean, horizontal arc, striking Red across the shoulder with a dull, meaty crack that dropped him to one knee. Samir followed it with a stomp that landed squarely in Red's midsection, knocking the wind from him before he collapsed entirely beside the booth. Across the diner, the youngest of the 3 gang members clawed at the counter, trying to regain his footing, but Gladys was already there. She grabbed the back of his collar, slammed his head once into the counter's edge, not enough to kill, just enough to remind him how easily she could have, and then dropped him to the ground like something she was finished with. Caleb struggled beneath Luther's weight, thrashing with all the fury of a man who had never been hit by someone who knew exactly where to strike. Luther's grip held firm, his arm flexing against the man's throat until the fight drained from his limbs. Caleb wheezed, his chest rising and falling like a drowning man, and when Luther released him, he slumped sideways, coughing and gasping, too stunned to speak. No one said a word. The diner was a wreck of toppled chairs and overturned plates, the scent of bacon now mixed with sweat, and the iron tang of split lips. The gang lay in 3 different corners of the room, bruised, broken, gasping, and the only sound was the slow ticking of the wall clock and the low hum of the ventilation fan. Buck exhaled through his nose, stepping away from Red without looking back. Samir rolled his shoulders once, and then crossed his arms again, as if nothing had happened at all. Gladys adjusted her scarf, checked her knuckles, and retrieved the peppermint she had dropped during the strike. Luther stood quietly beside Caleb, watching as the man tried and failed to push himself up from the vinyl booth. Esther, still standing near the door, took one small step inside. She looked at Caleb, not with rage, not with triumph, just with the calm disappointment of someone who had warned a fool and been ignored. She didn't need to speak. Her silence now rang louder than all their laughter had before. Caleb stumbled as Luther released him, his knees buckling beneath the weight of exhaustion and disbelief. He dropped against the booth, dragging his arm across the table as though trying to balance himself, his breath ragged, his voice stuck somewhere between a curse and a cough. His chest heaved with the sound of pride being forced out through cracked ribs. Red groaned from where he lay against the floor, one hand wrapped tightly around his side as he spat blood across the tile, his eyes flicking wildly from one veteran to the next, as if still searching for the moment they had turned from senior citizens into train destroyers. His face had lost the smirk. The swagger melted away into something quieter, something bitter and scared. The youngest, barely more than a boy, tried to crawl toward the entrance, but Gladys cut him off without a word, stepping over a shattered salt shaker and pinning him with her boot just between his shoulder blades. She didn't apply pressure. She didn't need to. The point had already been made. Luther helped Buck upright, not out of necessity, but with the familiarity of men who had fought back-to-back in tighter spaces than this. Buck nodded once in thanks, then reached down to collect his cane, tapping it once against the floor before pointing it toward the exit. "They're not done," he muttered, low but firm. "Get them outside." Samir moved immediately, not with violence, but with command. He reached down, grabbed Red by the collar, and lifted him to his feet in a single motion that made the man gasp. Red swung an elbow out of reflex, but Samir caught it in midair and twisted it gently behind his back until Red cried out in pain and stumbled forward toward the door. Gladys let her foot slide off the boy's back, then hauled him up by the scruff of his jacket, like a mother dragging a misbehaving child from Sunday service. He struggled at first, but one look into her eyes, still calm and cold, was enough to end the fight in his limbs. He walked, limped. Luther, without needing to speak, placed one hand on Caleb's shoulder and guided him out of the booth. Caleb tried to resist, but his legs were weak, and his breath came in shallow bursts. Every movement now betrayed his pain, the sharp twist of his ribs, the subtle hunch in his posture, the way his right arm clung protectively to his side. They pushed open the diner door, not with ceremony but with weight, and the cold evening air rushed in to meet them. The bell above the door gave another soft chime, though now it sounded more like a final note than a greeting. Outside, the fading daylight caught the scene and made it burn. The parking lot, still scattered with dust, became a stage. A handful of townspeople had gathered near the gas station and across the street, some drawn by the noise, others by intuition. No one stepped forward. No one said a word. The veterans led the gang into the open, spaced evenly like a perimeter forming without a command. They didn't shout. They didn't pose. They simply released the men in front of the waiting town and stepped back. Red dropped to his knees first, coughing, the blood staining the front of his shirt like a badge he hadn't asked for. The youngest followed, collapsing onto the curb and burying his face in his hands. Caleb stood longer than either of them, but even he wavered, his pride finally buckling under the stares of the people who had always believed him untouchable. The silence among the crowd grew heavier. There were no cheers, no words of approval, just the quiet shift of realization spreading through the onlookers as they tried to understand what they had just seen. The gang, so loud, so cruel, so confident, had been dismantled by 4 aging veterans and a woman who hadn't lifted a hand. And she stood now at the diner's entrance, framed by the doorway like something timeless. Esther's face bore no expression of triumph, no satisfaction in the sight of her tormentors brought low. She did not gloat. She did not speak. She simply stood with her hands resting lightly on her bag, her shoulders straight, her gaze fixed not on the men kneeling at her feet, but on the crowd beyond them. Her silence stretched outward, like a stone tossed into still water, rippling into every corner of the street, settling in the faces of those who watched and said nothing, the ones who had looked away in the diner, the ones who had laughed quietly behind menus or stirred coffee just to have something to do with their hands. They saw her now not as someone they'd forgotten or ignored, but as something unshakable, something ancient, something earned. Caleb raised his head, looking at her with eyes no longer filled with scorn, but with something closer to confusion, like a man staring at a monument he'd mistaken for a mailbox. "You think this changes anything?" he hissed, voice low and cracked, more breath than threat. Buck stepped beside Esther then, his cane planted firmly in the gravel, his gaze steady on Caleb's broken frame. "It already has." Esther said nothing, and it was louder than any warning Caleb had ever given in his life. Across the street, an old man who ran the hardware store turned and walked back into his shop without a word. A young woman holding a grocery bag shifted her weight, her mouth parting as if to speak, then thinking better of it. Others lingered, unsure of what to do with the new truth they had witnessed, unsure of what it demanded from them. Samir folded his arms again. Luther adjusted the strap of his satchel. Gladys finally unwrapped her peppermint and slipped it into her mouth, the scent of mint rising faintly into the air. The gang had been broken, not just physically, but publicly. Their hold on the town cracked under the weight of precision and experience. They had brought force. They had found discipline. Esther stepped out onto the curb, her shoes finding the edge of shadow and light. The sky above had darkened, the first hints of night blooming slowly across the horizon, and with it came a different kind of silence, the kind that follows a reckoning. She did not look at the men on the ground. She looked past them, because this was not the end. This was only the first reply. That night, the wind crept low over the rooftops and down the narrow streets like a rumor passed from one shuttered window to the next, brushing dust across the curbs and rattling the metal signage that hung above the closed shops lining the main road. Though the stars hung high above the town, casting their pale light across the cold pavement, they brought no comfort. The quiet that had settled after the diner fight was no longer the hush of a resolved moment, but something tighter, more brittle, like breath held too long in lungs already aching for release. Inside a dimly lit garage on the edge of town, Caleb Riggins sat hunched in the corner, beneath the flickering light of a single bulb, his shirt peeled away from his shoulder, where a long bruise spread across the bone. He held a towel to his ribs, which still screamed every time he shifted, though he did his best to hide it beneath a face hardened by humiliation. Red leaned beside the tool chest, a cigarette hanging crooked from his lips, his other hand pressing down on the darkening cloth wrapped around his forearm. Across from them, slouched on an overturned cooler with his elbows resting on his knees, sat Troy, still nicknamed Boy despite pushing 30, who nursed a swollen jaw with the same hand that had tried and failed to throw a punch inside the diner. No one laughed now. No one dared to make light of what had happened. The veterans had not shouted, had not rushed, had not warned. They had simply acted with the practiced efficiency of men and women who knew how to end a fight before it truly began. Their movements rooted in training deeper than these three had ever received. Built not in gyms or parking lot scraps, but in live rounds, real blood, and battlefields that had never asked them to explain themselves. They didn't even breathe hard, Troy muttered, his voice thick from the bruising. It's like they was waiting for us to blink. Red spat toward the corner, the sound sharp against the concrete, though he said nothing. The burn of shame had not left his skin since he hit the floor in front of the entire diner, his pride unraveling alongside the threadbare lie he had always told himself. That fear was a tool he could wield with ease, that people like Esther and Buck were relics too tired to matter. Caleb finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot but steady, his breath slow as he forced the words through a clenched jaw. "They let us walk away," he said, his voice low, rough like a blade pulled too fast through gravel. "Not 'cause they were merciful, because they wanted us to remember it. They wanted this town to remember it." Troy shook his head and dropped the ice pack onto the ground. Everybody saw it. "Can't undo that." "We don't need to undo it," Caleb replied, lifting his gaze fully now, the raw anger in his eyes sharpened by the insult of being outmaneuvered in front of his people. "We just need to remind them who runs this place after dark." Red chuckled, but it came out hollow. "Not sure that works anymore. Not when they've got war medals and half the town staring like they seen ghosts." Caleb leaned forward slowly, pain tightening his shoulders, but purpose straightening his spine. "Then, we don't go after them in daylight." And so they began, not with guns, not with fists, but with whispers of violence that could be denied in the daylight and multiplied in the dark. Across town, where porch lights flickered and curtains fluttered at the corners, the gang crept through alleys and around fences, avoiding the main roads and moving in the same shadows they had once mocked. Their rage had not softened. It had distilled into something colder, something calculated. By midnight, a fresh coat of spray paint had soaked through the side of Samir's garage, thick red lines carving crude shapes, hateful symbols slashed across brick and tin like open wounds. On Luther's truck, all 4 tires had been sliced open, and the windshield had been cracked clean through, spidering out from the center where a cinder block had left its quiet message. Gladys awoke to the sound of breaking glass, and when she stepped into her back porch, with her robe still cinched tight around her chest, she found her planters overturned, her porch windows shattered inward, the scent of earth and shattered blossoms seeping into the wood beneath her feet. At Esther's home, the garden had been stomped flat, rows of collard greens and azaleas crushed beneath bootprints, and scrawled across her front gate, in dripping black paint that had barely dried by dawn, was the word leave, the letters shaky but unmistakably angry, written by someone who wanted to feel in control again. None of them reported it. None of them called the sheriff. They already knew what would come of it. The same slow shrugs offered with lowered eyes, the same tired routine of forms passed across counters, the same hollow promises wrapped in polite apology and buried in silence that lasted longer than memory. They had lived through this pattern before, many times over, under different uniforms, behind different desks, but always the same ending. No protection, no consequence, no justice. So instead of wasting breath on men who would only blink and offer sympathy they did not mean, they gathered in Esther's kitchen just before sunrise, each of them carrying the signs of the night's violence, not as burdens to be spoken aloud, but as quiet affirmations of what they already knew with certainty, that they were on their own again, and had been for some time. The air in the house still held warmth from the stove, and the smell of chicory coffee lingered in the wallpaper and floorboards, mixing with a trace of lemon polish and something faintly metallic. But the comfort that once lived there had retreated beneath the surface, no longer present in the expressions of those who entered, nor in the way they moved, quiet, controlled, and stripped of any illusion that the danger had passed with the sunrise. Esther stood at the sink, her fingers curled around a chipped ceramic mug that had once belonged to her husband, the handle worn smooth where his thumb used to rest. She held it not for the coffee it contained, lukewarm and untouched, but for the weight it gave her hands while she stared out through the kitchen window, past the condensation, into the yard that had once been green and blooming. The garden lay in ruins now, the azaleas ripped from their beds and the collards flattened into the mud, their stems broken, their leaves bruised and blackening. Yet Esther did not look away from the destruction. She did not sigh or tremble. She simply stared, her jaw set, her spine rigid, her gaze locked onto the wreckage with the cold stillness of a woman who had seen worse and refused to be moved by anything less than war. When the others arrived, Buck first, his boots heavy on the porch, then Luther, walking slow and even as always, Samir, whose silence was its own presence, and Gladys, last through the door with a heavy quilt-wrapped bundle held in her arms. They did not offer greetings or apologies. Esther didn't expect them to. She gave them a single nod, nothing more, then placed the mug gently on the counter with a soft ceramic clink and turned toward the back door, her hand brushing the frame as she moved through it. They followed without hesitation. Outside, the sky was still dim, a thin orange band stretching across the horizon like the seam of something just beginning to tear. The grass was damp beneath their feet, mottled with dark patches of torn earth, and the air smelled faintly of crushed flowers and wet iron. The shed at the far end of the yard looked like any other, a simple wooden structure with a sagging roof, paint curling from the boards, and rust tracing the hinges like veins. The padlock on the door was more decoration than defense, long since oxidized and loose on its loop. Esther moved to the wall beside the door, reached behind a familiar brick, and pulled out a small iron key. The motion was precise, unhesitating, as though her fingers had never forgotten the weight or the shape of what they were about to unlock. She inserted it into the latch, turned until it clicked, and pushed the door open, the hinges letting out a low, aching groan that seemed to protest the hour. Inside, the air was cooler, shaded from the morning light, and thick with the scent of aged wood, spilled soil, and rusted metal. Along one side of the shed were bags of feed, a broken shovel, and several flower pots stacked beside a wheelbarrow whose wheel no longer turned. But Esther moved past all of it to the corner, where a piece of plywood lay slightly raised beneath an old crate. She shifted the crate aside and crouched slowly, her knees stiff but her focus undeterred, then lifted the panel to reveal a concrete slab, smooth and gray, with a small recessed ring bolted into its center. She tapped her foot twice against the edge, not out of habit, but as signal, then pressed her palm against the concrete's worn surface, letting her weight push down until a soft mechanical click echoed beneath them. The trapdoor groaned as it released, lifting slightly at one corner, and Esther stepped back, letting the others see what had been kept hidden. Below was a narrow staircase, cut into the earth and framed by cinder-block walls, the color of packed ash. The air that drifted up was cool and dry, tinged with the scent of dust and oil, but not decay. This was not a forgotten place. A single pull chain hung just inside the stairwell, and when Samir reached for it and gave it a gentle tug, the bulb at the base flickered to life with a slow hum, casting long shadows down the steps. One by one, they descended, not slowly because of age or injury, but with the quiet gravity of those returning to a place that had never truly let them go. There was reverence in their steps, the kind reserved for sanctuaries built not of prayer, but of purpose. The safe house beneath the shed was small, but prepared. Every corner had been maintained, every item preserved like a memory too vital to lose. Along the far wall, rows of tools sat arranged in careful order, their metal still clean and their handles wrapped in tape that had never peeled. Beside them, folded maps of the town were protected in sealed plastic covers, each one marked with red ink and fine thread. Old routes, supply paths, safe zones, and alternate exits. A tall cabinet stood near the back, its shelves lined with radio parts, batteries, and carefully labeled frequencies. In a locked crate beneath the steel table, wrapped in cloth and sealed in wax, were 3 sidearms, 1 bolt-action rifle, and several boxes of preserved ammunition, each one dated and recorded. Gladys moved to the medical supplies without being asked, checking labels and seals with the methodical grace of someone who had done it too many times to need instruction. Buck stood near the wall, running his fingers along the edge of the old phone line that had once connected to a switchboard in the house above, nodding to himself as if confirming that the world he remembered was still here, buried beneath the one that had replaced it. Luther moved to the maps, his eyes scanning familiar streets as he began to unfold plans written in ink decades ago. And Samir leaned against the far wall, his arms crossed, watching them all with a stillness that did not soften. "This was a station," Buck said, his voice low, more memory than observation. "Built for when it wasn't just survival, but defiance." Esther nodded once, her voice quiet but certain. "We built it during the marches, when they started pulling people from their homes in the middle of the night and calling it law. We couldn't stop it back then, not all of it, but we could survive. And now," she turned, facing each of them in turn, her eyes sharp and unwavering, her hands resting on the table's edge. "We don't survive this one. We stop it." They thought the fire would send a message, not just to the veterans, but to the town itself, that the gang, though beaten, was still capable of claiming fear as their weapon. It began in the quiet hour just before dawn, when the wind carried only the soft rustle of tree branches and the occasional barking dog, and the church stood still at the corner of Mason and Fifth, its white siding pale in the low moonlight. its wooden cross planted proudly in the front lawn like a sentinel watching over the block. The first flames caught at the foundation, creeping up the clapboard walls with slow, greedy fingers, curling into the edges of the sanctuary windows until the stained glass fractured with a sharp pop, sending shards tumbling into the grass like colored snow. The fire spread fast, the dry timber crackling like old bones breaking beneath pressure, and within minutes the roof sagged inward, spilling embers into the night sky in bright, angry flares. By the time someone called the fire department, the steeple had already collapsed, and the heat from the blaze had scorched the nearby trees black. When it was over, nothing remained but the shell of the church, its skeleton charred and sagging, and the cross in the yard smoldering on its side, half buried in the scorched grass. Pastor Elijah stood barefoot in the street, still in his undershirt and slacks, his face drawn in stunned silence as the congregation gathered in the early morning light. The firemen did their job with little urgency, moving like they already knew it was too late. When the sheriff finally arrived, hours later, he stood with his hands on his hips, sunglasses on, and offered no report, no real questions. Just a tired shrug, a mumbled line about faulty wiring, and a promise to look into it. But no one believed the lie, not even the sheriff who spoke it. Word traveled fast, whispered from stoop to store counter, from school hallway to barbershop chair. Some lowered their eyes and muttered that it was a shame. Others looked away entirely, and a few, in corners where they thought no one could hear, allowed themselves quiet smiles. The town began to splinter, not with open conflict, not yet, but with something colder. People who once waved now crossed the street. Longtime neighbors stopped making eye contact. Some left porch lights off when they knew the veterans were on patrol. Others started locking their doors in broad daylight. At Esther's, the radio buzzed constantly now. A low hum of static and coded check-ins passed between Luther's modified units. Buck had taken control of route assignments, coordinating patrols through the blocks most vulnerable to drive-bys or silent attacks. Samir led the installation of cameras purchased with pooled retirement checks, mounting them high into the corners of buildings, threading power through back walls and hidden panels. Gladys reinforced the windows at the community center, bolting thick wood beneath the outer trim and layering mesh beneath the glass, while teens from the neighborhood followed her instructions with solemn hands and quiet reverence. They weren't preparing for rumors. They were preparing for war. Each corner was charted, each alley assigned, each porch light tracked by whether it remained lit through the night or flickered out just after the patrols passed. Still, the silence from the town pressed in like smoke, thick, choking, and just subtle enough to pass as absence. So Esther decided it was time to speak. The town meeting was held that Thursday, just after sunset, in the old high school auditorium where generations had once gathered to watch spring plays and fall debates. The folding chairs creaked beneath the weight of too many years and too much silence, and the stage lights cast long shadows across the far wall. The air was thick with a hush that wasn't quite tension, but wasn't far from it. Some came out of obligation. Others came to be seen. A few came because they were afraid and didn't know which direction the fear was supposed to face. Esther stood at the podium, dressed in her Sunday best, her locket gleaming softly beneath the lights, her hands resting firmly on either side of the worn wood, like she was holding up the weight of something far older than the town itself. She didn't speak right away. She let the silence fill the room until it became a mirror, until everyone who had tried to ignore the fire felt it settle on their shoulders. "When I was a little girl," she began, her voice calm but unshakable, "they used to burn churches to warn us that our prayers had no place here." A murmur passed through the room, soft and shifting, but no one interrupted. They didn't come in daylight. They came while we slept. They came when no one wanted to look, and they left ashes behind for us to sweep up. She paused, letting her gaze move from face to face, her expression unreadable. "I have seen what silence does," I have lived in towns where it let monsters build houses and call them home. I have buried people who died waiting for neighbors to grow spines. Someone near the back shifted uncomfortably. Another folded their arms. But Esther never raised her voice, never clenched her hands, never wavered. Silence is not neutral, she continued. It is a choice, and every person in this room is making that choice right now. She stepped back then, letting the weight of her words sink into the floorboards, and returned to her seat without fanfare, without applause. For a long moment, no one said anything. Then, slowly, a few people began to nod. Not all, not many, but enough. The meeting ended without a resolution, without a vote, without even a motion. But something had shifted, however slightly. The silence was no longer complete. A crack had formed, and through it, the faintest sound of something else began to stir. Awareness, discomfort, maybe even the early shape of courage. But outside, in trucks parked just beyond the edge of the school lot, Caleb and his boys watched from behind the windshield. They saw who walked in. They saw who stayed late. They wrote down names. The gang wasn't retreating. They were taking inventory, and the town had just drawn its first dividing line in chalk. The town had always lived with secrets, small ones tucked into old barns and backyards, family feuds that simmered for decades beneath tight smiles and polite handshakes. But now, the secrets were larger, heavier, more dangerous, and no one could quite say when the line had been crossed from uneasy silence to active betrayal. One thing, however, had become clear to the veterans by the end of that week. The town was no longer just divided. It was compromised. Claire Monroe parked her cruiser 2 blocks away from Esther's house, cut the engine, and walked the rest of the distance with her badge tucked out of sight, and her radio turned off. She had not told the sheriff where she was going, and she hadn't written it down anywhere official. The decision to knock on Esther's front door wasn't one she had made lightly, but something about the fire, the silence that followed it, and the unspoken shift in the way people avoided each other on the street had unsettled her enough to stop waiting for someone else to do something. She found Esther in the backyard, standing at the edge of what used to be her garden, the soil still bearing the bruises of boots and the withered remains of crushed plants curling beneath the morning sun. Esther didn't turn when Claire approached. She waited, still as stone, until the younger woman cleared her throat gently. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Claire said. "I'm just here to talk." Esther didn't move right away, but when she finally turned, her eyes narrowed. Not in suspicion, but in careful calculation. "Trouble's already here, Deputy," she said. "You'll have to be more specific." Claire didn't argue. She simply nodded and followed Esther inside. In the kitchen, over a mug of the strongest coffee she'd had in months, Claire listened as Esther laid out what had been done, not with dramatics or accusation, but with simple facts: the church fire, the threats, the graffiti, the broken windows and slashed tires, the names they suspected but could not prove. Claire had heard rumors of all of it, but seeing the list laid out on the table, scribbled in Luther's clean block handwriting beside dates, times, and street names, changed something in her. "I tried to bring it up last week," Claire said, her voice lower now, more cautious. "The sheriff told me it was best not to poke at old tension, that we'd only stir things up if we started picking sides." Esther didn't flinch. "If you're not picking a side, you've already picked one." There was no arguing that. Claire sat with it for a long moment, then leaned forward. "I want to help, but I can't be seen with you too often." "Not yet." She stayed for 2 hours, long enough to memorize faces on a wall of Polaroids pinned above the pantry door, long enough to read through the map of locations where incidents had occurred, long enough to ask the right questions, and begin gathering her own list of names. When she left, it was without a handshake, without a thank you. Just a nod between soldiers who hadn't worn the same uniform but understood the same war. But elsewhere, another badge moved with different intent. Eric Riggins sat alone in the station locker room, the radio on his belt crackling faintly beneath his jacket. He was Caleb's cousin, blood tied in from both sides of a family tree that bent in ugly directions. And though he wore the same patch as Claire, he played by different rules. The gang didn't need him to carry out their threats. They only needed his silence when evidence disappeared, when footage went missing, when calls came in and were conveniently marked as resolved. Now, after the town meeting and the rumors that followed, Caleb had begun asking for more. Names, times, schedules, whispers about where the veterans were gathering and what they were planning. And Eric, quiet and cautious, passed the information piece by piece. Never too much, never enough to draw suspicion, but it was enough to start closing the net. Inside the veterans' network, the signals began to warp. Luther, sitting alone in the safe house one night, adjusting the dials on the old military radio, intercepted a strange pattern. Short bursts of static followed by clicks, then silence, then a low tone repeated every 7 seconds. He ran it through 2 frequencies, then flipped to the encrypted band they'd been using. It wasn't theirs. They were being watched. When he brought it to the others, they didn't panic. They adjusted. More cameras went up, silent, wireless, and hidden in light fixtures and mailboxes. Patrols were altered every day, never repeating routes. Samir rewired the back doors of 3 houses in the veterans' inner circle so that alarms would trip silently and send a vibration alert through Esther's radio system. They began speaking in code, writing in shorthand, leaving instructions not on paper, but in placement. An overturned mug, a crooked picture frame, a tin of mints turned backward on the shelf. They began using the underground safe house as a communications hub, connecting old circuits through cell boosters and abandoned landlines buried in the crawl space beneath Esther's shed. Each member had a second phone now, powered only when needed and left wrapped in foil when not in use. The network expanded in slow, precise moves, contacting trusted allies from older days, reaching out to younger ones willing to learn. The town was no longer safe, but it was watched. Every alley, every doorway, every porch that flickered out at night now marked a pattern. And while they still didn't know who was feeding information to the gang, they knew it was coming from inside the structure. There was a leak, but not a drop too large yet. Just enough to sting. And still, Caleb moved in the shadows, planning, waiting, coiled. It was just after 2 in the morning when the shot rang out across Miller Street, slicing through the night air with a sound so sharp it startled the birds nesting in the street lamps and sent every dog on the block into a chorus of panicked barking. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was recoil. The air itself pulled tight as the echo faded, leaving only the thud of a body hitting the ground and the soft whimper of a wounded breath trying to stay steady. Samir had been walking his patrol route, same time he had for the past 3 nights, moving in the blind spots between cameras and windows, his footfalls measured, his head on a slow swivel. He wore his old tactical vest beneath a coat too thick for summer, but necessary now, because they knew the gang had escalated. What he didn't know was how far they'd come. The bullet hit just below the ribcage, tearing through muscle and dropping him to one knee, but it was the second shot, clean, measured, just a hair too high, that told him this wasn't panic fire. This was a marksman, someone with training, someone who had waited. He didn't scream. He didn't panic. Samir dropped flat, rolled behind a trash bin, pressed both hands to the wound, and reached for the encrypted radio clipped to his side. Blood poured fast, pooling beneath him as he relayed 2 words. Just 2, but enough. Contact. South. Esther's voice came back within seconds, calm, clear, already moving. They reached him in under 6 minutes. Luther first, then Buck and Gladys behind him, moving like a machine that had been tested too many times to fail now. The shooter was gone, vanished into alleyways mapped by memory and reinforced with familiarity. But the message had been sent. This was no longer street-level intimidation. This was military precision, timed ambush, sniper position, trained hands, and cold intent. They got Samir to the safe house and stabilized him, the underground room turning for the first time from strategy hub to emergency triage. Gladys worked silently, her hands bloodied but steady as she stitched and pressed and whispered old prayers beneath her breath. Esther stood above him the whole time, her expression carved in stone, her fingers wrapped around the edge of the table until the veins showed white through her skin. He would live, but barely. And they all knew it now. The gang was no longer improvising. They were planning. The next morning, Buck led a search through the northern edge of the woods, where footprints had been spotted leading off the road past the community center. 2 miles in, they found the cabin, an old hunting structure with a rusted chimney and camouflaged canvas tacked over the windows. The inside smelled of gun oil and damp wood. The walls were bare, but the table in the center held everything they needed to understand what came next. Maps, blueprints, radio logs, hand-drawn diagrams of the veterans' patrol routes and Esther's home, an overlay of the neighborhood water lines. Proof they'd been watching from beneath as well as above. Red circles marked key structures: the school, the church ruins, the market. At the center of the map, one word had been scrawled in thick pencil: Purge. Luther stood still, reading the map for a long time, his jaw clenched, his eyes unmoving. Buck sifted through the loose papers, finding receipts for ammunition, hand-drawn schedules, surveillance photos of the veterans mid-patrol. Nothing about this was random. This wasn't just retaliation. It was preparation. They were planning a full siege. Esther arrived at the cabin just as Buck was photographing the wall. She said nothing at first, just looked at the map, then at the photos, then out through the cracked window into the dense line of trees that framed the horizon like a waiting mouth. "This is war," she said finally. No more wondering. That night, she made the calls. She pulled the phone from the same metal box beneath the safe house floor and dialed numbers that hadn't been touched in years. One by one, the voices answered. Old names, familiar codes, people from Baton Rouge, Atlanta, Houston, friends from other marches, other towns, other nights, when survival had come down to how fast you could act, and how many people you trusted to act with you. She didn't ask for help. She simply said, "It's time." They understood. By the end of the next day, 3 more patrol units were active, drawn from towns just over the border. 2 men from Mississippi who had once shared a barracks with Buck, a pair of sisters from Charlotte who had trained under Gladys during the storm years, an old radio tech from Birmingham who didn't walk without a cane anymore, but still remembered how to crack a signal. The network was growing, and though the town above them kept shifting further into suspicion and fear, though some neighbors turned their backs, while others stood paralyzed on the sidelines, the veterans never stopped moving. The safe house expanded. Routes multiplied. Watch posts were added to the old water tower and the church bell that hadn't rung since the fire. A second layer of cameras went in. Infrared, motion-triggered, time-lapsed. They kept every feed off-grid, every cable hidden, every rotation unpatterned. They didn't wait for approval. They didn't ask for permission, because Samir had nearly died for walking his own street. And now they knew without question that the next time it wouldn't be an ambush. It would be an assault. Gladys had always been quiet in her watching, deliberate in her noticing. It was a habit carved from decades of tending to wounds before soldiers even admitted they were in pain, of pulling truth from the tension in someone's walk long before they gave voice to it. So when Buck winced during morning drills, just a flicker in the lines around his eyes, a slight favoring of his left side when standing from the bench, she didn't say anything. Not the first time, not even the second, but by the third time, when he grunted softly while lifting a crate and tried to pass it off with a joke about getting soft, she put down her own pack and followed him. She waited until they were alone in the side corridor of the safe house, just beyond the reach of the others, where the cement floor met earth, and the light bulb overhead hummed with a steady flicker. He was bent slightly at the waist, resting one hand on the wall, his cane balanced against the opposite knee. His breath was controlled, but not steady. "You're hiding something," she said plainly. Not a question, but a diagnosis. Buck didn't turn around right away. He shifted his weight, gripped the edge of the workbench beside him, and took a slow, steadying breath before he finally spoke. Voice low, worn smooth by years of silence. "It's cancer." The word hung in the air like gunfire. Quiet, but impossible to ignore. "They said 6 months. That was 5 ago." Gladys didn't answer immediately. She stepped forward until she stood beside him, close enough to feel the heat coming off his skin, the slow tremor beneath his stillness. He turned finally and met her gaze. Not with defiance, but with resignation that wasn't defeat. "I didn't come back to outlive it," he said, voice quieter now. "I came back to finish what was started before the world pretended to change." "You should have told me," she said, not with anger, but with a sharp sadness that settled deeper than grief. "I knew what you'd say," Buck replied, managing the hint of a smile. "You'd try to keep me out of the fire. But you know better than most. We don't get to sit out the last stand." Gladys placed a hand on his arm, not in comfort, not in pity, but in shared resolve. She didn't cry. She didn't protest. She simply stood there, hand steady, as if grounding them both. "You're not dying here," she said. "Not like that. You'll die standing, if you must, but not before we make this right." And with that, they returned to the table, together, where Esther was waiting. Meanwhile, across town, Claire Monroe sat in her cruiser, beneath the shadow of the abandoned train station, her face lit by the pale glow of her dashboard as Eric Riggins leaned casually against the driver's side door, his boots crunching gravel with every slow, measured shift of weight. She had invited him for coffee, off-duty, no uniform, no clipboard, just 2 colleagues with a shared badge and 1,000 unspoken assumptions. The recorder was hidden beneath the steering column, just within reach, its light blinking red. She didn't bait him. She didn't push. She simply let him talk, and he did. Not directly, never outright, but enough. He spoke in careful phrases, like a man who'd learned to speak just past the truth, brushing it without holding it. "Ain't like they didn't start it," he muttered. "You think they didn't know what would happen, stirring all that up again?" Claire didn't respond. "I'm just saying, a man's got a right to protect what's his. Folks like Caleb, they're just trying to make sure things don't slide too far the wrong direction." She nodded slowly, as though considering it, letting him go on. "You think they're the only ones with a network? Nah. We've had eyes on them since before that fight in the diner. They move. We move." He smiled. Not cruel, but careless. Balance, right? Just trying to keep things even. That night, Claire played the recording in the safe house. The words weren't an outright confession, but they were enough. Enough to confirm what they had long suspected. Enough to chart the leak. Enough to set the next step in motion. Luther drew the plan out in tight black strokes across the chalkboard wall. A staged strategy session, positioned at the old utility depot near Hollow Bridge, a site just outside the grid where signal could still be intercepted. It was unsecured, deliberately sloppy, the perfect bait. The fake meeting went live at 8:03 p.m. Claire whispered it into the radio line Eric had passed to the gang a dozen times before. By 9:27, 2 vehicles rolled up the back path of the depot, headlights off, tires slowed, doors easing open before the engines even cooled. 4 men emerged, armed, deliberate, moving with that quiet, ugly confidence that came from thinking they were catching someone unaware. But the building was empty. What wasn't empty was the sky above them, where one of the new infrared drones, silent, hovering, invisible in the darkness, tracked each movement, logged every face, every angle of approach, every license plate, every name. They had come for an ambush, but they had walked into a ledger. The timing matched. Eric had gone off duty 20 minutes before the trucks moved. The access code he used to pull his cruiser log was the same one used to reroute a street camera near the school. Claire matched it. Luther confirmed it. Esther listened to the sequence twice before she nodded. They wouldn't confront Eric. Not yet. They would let him play his part a little longer. Feed him controlled data. Watch how the gang moved. Measure the pace. Follow the flow. Because now they knew the shape of the network. And they were going to use it to pull Caleb into the light, one step at a time. And when he finally reached for what he thought was victory, when he thought he had them exposed, they would be waiting. Not behind him, but all around. They knew how the gang thought. That was the advantage age gave them, not just experience in tactics, but the patience to see beyond impulse. They understood that pride, when bruised, became reckless. And if they handed the gang an opportunity to reclaim control, the bait would be taken without hesitation. So they planted the story. Quietly, confidently, leaked from Claire to Eric, who passed it with the same practiced care he had used since the beginning. A convoy, he was told, would be moving through the northern woods under darkness, unmarked, light on guards, and carrying surveillance equipment that could tip the balance in the veterans' favor. Just one truck, parked in the clearing at Hollow Creek, where the pines bent over the old logging path and muffled everything above a whisper. Eric never questioned it. He relayed it just as they knew he would. The gang moved in force. That night, Caleb led his men through the tree line with the precision of someone who had convinced himself this was justice, not vengeance. They were ready. At least, they believed they were. Weapons primed, flashlights blacked out, vehicles left behind to avoid engine noise. 12 men crept through the trees with radios at their hips and sweat clinging to their brows, their confidence buoyed by the idea that they were about to cut the head from a snake. At the center of the clearing, just as described, sat the truck. Dusty, idle, its headlights dark, and its windows rolled down as though someone had left in a hurry. They spread out, forming a perimeter. Caleb and Red approached first, signaling the rest to hold their ground while they cleared the cab. Red opened the driver's side door, weapon raised, eyes scanning the interior. Nothing, not a soul, not a sound, just the faint rustle of pine needles underfoot. Then came the first hiss. It was soft, almost delicate, the pop of a canister released from a tree branch overhead, followed by a stream of thick, white smoke that curled down like fog kissed with firelight. Then another, and another. 4 canisters, each placed in perfect triangulation around the clearing, began to flood the woods with a choking, vision-stealing fog. Within seconds, the men were silhouettes in a storm, waving hands and calling names, their voices swallowed by confusion and cloud. They never saw the veterans coming. Buck moved first, slipping through the smoke like he'd rehearsed the route 100 times. And he had. He disabled the first man with a swift pressure point strike to the collarbone, caught his wrist, and removed the rifle in one motion. Luther came in behind him, pulling a wire taut across 2 trees as another gang member sprinted blind and fast. He went down hard, landing in a coil of leaves that hid a net underneath, now cinched around his limbs. Gladys worked the edge of the clearing, using a flashlight strapped to her chest, to disorient 2 men stumbling out of formation. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She simply moved with intention, baton striking knee, elbow, wrist, dropping them like folding chairs. Samir moved like smoke himself, retrieving weapons, dragging the stunned into position, zip-tying wrists and ankles with a rhythm that didn't need speed. It only needed certainty. None of the veterans carried live rounds. That was never the point. They disarmed, they disabled, they dismantled, and in under 5 minutes, the clearing fell silent again. This time with the echo of a lesson well taught. Those who weren't captured ran. Some tripped over their own men. Others tossed their weapons and disappeared into the trees. Caleb shouted once, a low growl of rage that echoed off bark and branch. But even he knew this was not the moment to make a final stand. He retreated, dragging Red with him, breath shallow, shirt torn, pride ripped clean from his chest. The veterans did not follow. They didn't need to, because the message had landed. But victory never came without cost. As they returned through the southern path, their boots heavy with sweat and the drag of adrenaline fading, a strange light began to glow against the sky. Pale orange, too high and too wide for sunrise. Luther was the first to recognize it for what it was. Samir ran ahead. The others followed, faster now, feet pounding soil as the scent of smoke hit the air. By the time they reached Esther's home, the fire had already claimed half the roof. The windows glowed like furnaces, flames dancing through the parlor curtains, licking at the porch swing and blackening the trellis where her azaleas once bloomed. The front steps were splintered, and her garden, what remained of it, was now only ash. Esther didn't cry. She stepped forward, jaw clenched, fists tight, eyes fixed on the silhouette of her house against the firelight. But when she tried to walk toward it, Buck was already there. He moved in front of her and held her by the shoulders, not with force, but with steadiness. "You can't go in," he said quietly, firmly. "They're in there," she whispered. "My family, my history, They burned your walls," he said. Voice low, voice steady, voice clear enough to reach through the flames. "But not your fight. We still have that." He turned her gently as the roof caved inward with a moan, a spray of embers arcing into the night. "They can't burn that." Esther stood still, her breath shivering at the edge of her ribs, her silhouette outlined by the fire that consumed everything she had built. Then she nodded once, small, sharp, and final. They could take her house. They could not take her war. The fire didn't end the fight. It sharpened it. By morning, the veterans no longer spoke in terms of defense. There were no more perimeter drills, no more warnings passed along porches, or cautionary glances cast at the edges of gatherings. Esther's house, once the heart of their quiet resistance, had burned to the ground, and with it went the last thread of pretense that this war could be won with dignity alone. Something in the smoke had stripped the hesitation from their bones, and now every action moved with the quiet, furious rhythm of resolve, turned inward. They began with the vehicles. 3 trucks belonging to known gang members were found disabled in the lot behind the diner. Their fuel lines had been slit with surgical precision, tires flattened, tracking devices affixed beneath the rear bumpers, small black nodes wired with batteries, untraceable except by the hands that had placed them. Luther had spent the night calibrating the signals with Claire's borrowed equipment, mapping every route the gang used from their cabins to their drop points. Within 2 days, the veterans had eyes on every movement. Claire funneled what she could to federal channels. Quietly, through old contacts, she trusted more than her badge. Names, faces, connections to hate groups and rallies in other counties, damning records, archived posts, old assault charges buried by friendly judges. It wasn't fast justice, but it was a rope now tightening around necks that had gone unchecked for too long. Every name placed on a watch list meant one less place to hide. Every leaked photo online, men saluting flags no longer flown in public, grinning beside burning signs, faces caught on camera during defacement, eroded the illusion of control they had wielded in the town for generations. But not all the work could be done from behind a screen. It was late afternoon when Esther found herself standing in the tall grass behind the Reynolds barn, the sun low enough to set shadows reaching across the earth like hands. She had gone alone, not because it was wise, but because she had needed air, needed the silence of a place not filled with whispers and radio static. She was planting a second tracker beneath the grain silo when the sound reached her. Short, fast bursts of spray paint hissing into silence, the sharp click of a can shaken behind the west wall. She moved slowly, hand resting on the edge of the barn, boots quiet in the dirt. When she stepped around the corner, The figure didn't notice her at first. His back was to her, hoodie loose over his shoulders, jeans streaked with paint. The wall in front of him bore a half-finished slur, crude and venomous, dripping black into the old wood. "Put it down," she said, her voice low, not trembling, but wrapped in something more complex than fear. The young man turned quickly, startled, but didn't run. The can clattered to the ground, and for a long, hanging moment, the air between them was still. He couldn't have been more than 20. His face was sharp at the edges, jaw locked, mouth twisted in the early shape of defiance. But it wasn't the hardness in his expression that struck her. It was the shape of his eyes, the curve of his nose, the way his left eyebrow slanted slightly downward when he frowned. Something deep in her memory stirred like dust rising from an unopened drawer. Then her voice cracked, not with weakness, but with recognition. "Marcus?" The name hit the air like an old bell, long unused, still echoing. His stance shifted, not quite a step back, not quite a flinch. She took a breath, steadying the tremor in her hands. "Marcus Isaiah Hill. Your mother's name was Janine, my sister. You were taken when you were 9. He didn't answer. His face didn't soften. "You were raised by the Wilkersons, outside Monroe," she said, her voice firmer now, the words pulled from scars, not stories. "We looked for you. I wrote letters. They never answered." He took a step back, not out of fear, but defiance. "You people gave me up." "No," she said, the word thick with pain. "They took you." Something in her tone made his hand falter at his side, just slightly, barely a flicker, but she saw it. "You painted my name on that wall," she said quietly, gesturing toward the slur half-dried on the boards. "And still I knew your face. I knew it, because I held you when your fever broke, because I sang to you when your mother couldn't lift her head. And even now, I see you beneath all this anger that was never yours to carry." His jaw tensed. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," she said. "I know hate wasn't born in you. It was planted, and I see the roots are still shallow." He stared at her for a long moment, long enough for the wind to shift, for the sun to dip behind a cloud, for whatever war was happening behind his eyes to tighten its grip. Then he turned. Not fast, not in panic, but with decision. He ran. She didn't chase him. She only stood there, heart pounding, breath thick in her throat, hand trembling not with fear, but with the weight of a name returned after too many years of silence. She looked at the wall, at the word, at the drips still running down like wounds, and without a word, she bent down, picked up the can, and sprayed straight through the middle of it, black over black, until the hate was buried beneath something else. Then she walked away, not shaken in purpose, but with something deeper inside her beginning to shift. An old wound stirred open, and with it, the ache of what this war had always truly been about. Not land, not pride, but what people forget when they are taken, and what others remember, even after everything burns. There was no more waiting. Caleb didn't speak in riddles anymore. His plans no longer simmered beneath layers of plausible deniability or back-alley whispers. After the truck ambush and the online exposure, after the photos and the arrests, and the sudden tightening of law enforcement eyes from beyond county lines, he understood that time was no longer on his side. So he did what men like him always did when the illusion of dominance slipped through their fingers. He chose violence, loud and final, as if fire could drown the fear in his chest. At sundown, 12 trucks fanned out across the highways and dirt roads that framed the edges of the town. Men in body armor dismounted with rifles strapped across their backs, faces covered in bandanas and tactical masks, their movements rigid, prepared, deliberate. Portable jammers were placed on the outskirts, devices smuggled in from out of state, designed to collapse the local cell towers in minutes. By nightfall, phones across the town went dead. Radios turned to static. The roads leading in and out were blocked by stolen vehicles arranged like barricades. Tires slashed, engines drained, windshields coated in mud and tar, to obscure visibility from helicopters or drones. But the veterans had not waited idly either. In the safe house beneath Esther's old shed, what remained of the foundation that the fire hadn't touched, she stood at the head of the steel table, one hand resting on a map now covered in new markings, the other steady at her side. Around her stood the final core of their resistance. Gladys, calm and resolute. Luther, leaning over the map with one knuckle pressed to a marked street corner. Samir, pale but upright, a compression vest beneath his jacket, and fire in his eyes. Claire, now in tactical gear stripped of insignia, her badge tucked into her pocket as she loaded rounds into a sidearm she hadn't touched since her academy years. Pastor Elijah stood in the doorway, hands folded, lips moving in a soft rhythm that blended prayer with warning. He said no grand sermon, no booming calls for courage. He spoke only to each of them in turn, his words low, steady, personal, binding faith to action with a clarity that steadied their breath and made space for resolve. Esther didn't raise her voice during the briefing. She didn't pace or shout. She pointed, calmly, precisely, at each location: the old diner, the church ruins, the west alley behind the school, the bridge, the water tower, the spots where she knew the gang would try to divide them, where visibility was weakest, where panic would give them the illusion of control. And then she said it plainly, her voice strong enough to steady the room. They want to take the town piece by piece. We don't give them pieces. The final words came from Buck. He stood last, hand braced on his cane, vest already buckled tight, the remote detonator secured beneath his coat pocket. His breath was labored now, each word wrapped in a deeper knowing, each glance around the room heavy with more than orders. It was farewell, even if he refused to say it out loud. If they want to choke this place, he said, we make them swallow fire. When the first explosion lit up the cornfields east of the bridge, it split the night like a gunshot inside the chest. Bright orange flames erupted from beneath the wooden slats, and a thunderclap of force sent planks and nails scattering into the water below. Caleb's backup trucks, waiting at the ridge, were halted instantly, stranded, divided, cut off. Buck had pressed the detonator himself, crouched behind a ridge of dirt just west of the trestle, his hand still wrapped around the trigger even after the blast faded. He watched the chaos unfold with clear eyes, then turned and moved slowly down the hill to rejoin the others. The town, now a war zone in truth, braced for the push. Gunfire opened on Jefferson Avenue. Red flare smoke signaled movement along the alley behind the church ruins. A fire was lit behind the diner's kitchen, flames licking the wall where Esther had once sat, drinking her tea in peace. Claire held the northern alley, crouched behind an overturned cart, exchanging rounds with a pair of masked men using the shadows of the old print shop as cover. Her aim was clean, her breathing controlled, her grip unwavering. Luther and Gladys swept through the churchyard, using broken gravestones as cover, intercepting one group attempting to flank the eastern side of the school. One man swung a bat toward Gladys, but she stepped inside the arc with grace, brought the butt of her rifle down on his collarbone, and moved past him without stopping. Samir took the high ground near the water tower. His shot was low, but controlled. One slug to the shoulder, enough to drop the man crawling toward the generator shed. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He reloaded. And Buck saw the flash before he heard it. A muzzle flare from the side of the tree line near Esther's makeshift command post, aimed low but true. The bullet struck him square beneath the ribs, sliding past the vest's edge, tearing something deep. He grunted once, stumbled, then moved forward anyway, forcing himself between Esther and the shooter's second aim. He didn't fall right away. He stood long enough to lift his arm, fire a single shot back, and stagger against the post as the shooter fled into the dark. Esther caught him as he sank to one knee, her hands catching beneath his arms, lowering him carefully to the ground as the distant sound of battle continued to burn behind them. He looked up at her, blood already staining through his coat, his breath shallow. "Don't you dare cry!" he rasped. She didn't. He swallowed, his fingers curling around her wrist, not to hold, but to anchor himself. "You hold the line!" His eyes didn't close as he said it. They just stopped looking. Buck's body was still warm when Esther stood. She did not scream. She did not collapse. Her hands didn't tremble. Instead, she knelt beside him with the care of someone closing a chapter not in haste, but with reverence. Her fingers moved with quiet purpose as she folded his coat beneath his head, straightened his collar, and placed his hand gently across his chest, one palm resting over the place where the bullet had entered, where the blood had already begun to cool beneath the fabric. Her own hand lingered there for a moment longer, not to stop the bleeding. It was far too late for that, but to absorb the final echo of warmth from the man who had stood beside her through war, through silence, through fire. Then she reached for his radio, fingers steady, and brought it to her lips. Her voice, when it came through the comms, did not break. It did not falter. It cut through the static with the clarity of a blade, tempered by mourning but forged in iron. "Buck's down. Position 3 is compromised. Reroute south. Lock Phase 4. We finish it." She didn't wait for confirmation. She rose, tucked the radio into her coat, and turned toward the smoke rising at the edge of Main Street, her face unreadable, her steps certain. Across town, her voice was heard in every ear that needed to hear it. Claire, crouched behind the rusted frame of the school's loading dock, adjusted her stance instantly. She pulled back from the eastern corner, signaled to the two young men flanking her, boys barely old enough to vote, now holding the line with their teeth clenched and their hearts burning, and moved them toward the rear alley. She didn't speak. She just tapped once on the barrel of her rifle, then pointed left. They followed without question. In the narrow lanes behind the laundromat, Luther caught the transmission mid-step. He didn't pause to process it. He didn't curse, didn't gasp. He simply raised one fist into the air, tight, still, deliberate. And Gladys, positioned half a block behind him, caught the signal. She tightened the sling around her arm, adjusted the strap of her rifle across her shoulder, and moved to flank without a word. Between them, they cleared the street like they had done in another country, another lifetime. Only now, the war had come home. Up in the water tower scaffolding, where wind scraped along rusted iron and visibility stretched in every direction, Samir heard Esther's voice break through the static, like a voice from memory. His chest rose slower than before, each breath still tight from the damage he'd taken days ago. But he didn't hesitate. He adjusted his scope, shifted his weight, and repositioned his rifle toward the intersection just north of the diner. His sightline cleared as a gang vehicle sped into view. Too fast, too loud, too late. He didn't fire yet. Not until the wheels crossed the mark he and Luther had set with stones and twine. Then he exhaled, gently squeezed the trigger, and clipped the tire clean through. The truck spun sideways and stalled, blocking the street. Samir ducked, reloaded, and smiled without mirth. Esther's voice had done more than issue an order. It had opened the gate. The veterans moved like clockwork now, not because they had no fear, but because the fear no longer mattered. Buck's death was not the end. It was the ignition. His final breath had passed through each of them like a torch carried in silence, not for vengeance, but for certainty. The line would hold, not in his name alone, but because it was the only way forward. The town, still cloaked in smoke and noise, shifted with the weight of that message. Doors creaked open. Lights blinked on behind curtained windows. People emerged not in crowds, not in chants, but in quiet, steady motion. They carried buckets, boards, radios, rifles. They carried medicine, blankets, tools. They walked into the war not with bravado, but with choice, because Esther had drawn a line and Buck had laid across it, And now it was their turn to decide which side of that sacrifice they would stand on. Esther crossed Jennings Street beneath a sky flickering with firelight, her coat trailing behind her like a flag too proud to lower. Around her, the others converged, Gladys taking up the rear, Samir now on foot as he descended the tower's ladder one rung at a time, Luther sweeping back around the block with his jaw set tight and his eyes focused on the distant shapes moving just beyond the courthouse lawn. They didn't ask for orders. They already knew them. This was the march to finish it, not with rage, not with glory, but with the same calm, ruthless precision that had pulled them through deserts, jungles, cities, and the long, bitter nights that followed. And when they reached the courthouse steps, Esther stopped at the top, looked down at the town below, smoke curling through the alleys, light flickering against broken glass, the streets littered with weapons left behind by men who thought hate was armor, and she said nothing. She only raised Buck's radio to her lips one last time. "We're holding!" The sun had risen fully by the time the smoke began to thin. The town, once cloaked in gunpowder haze and the roar of conflict, now stood beneath a pale morning sky that cast long shadows over broken fences and shattered windows. Fires had been reduced to embers. Spent casings glinted like seeds scattered across the street. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. Not yet. But it was thick with something heavier than exhaustion. It was awareness. And with it came reckoning. Esther hadn't spoken since her last words on the radio. She moved with purpose, slow and deliberate, as she walked the perimeter of the square, pausing now and then to exchange glances with those who had finally come forward. The war had burned hot and fast, but the fight beneath it, the one waged in the hearts of the townspeople, was just beginning to smolder. At midday, as they gathered in the courtyard beneath the courthouse steps, Claire approached the veterans with a strange look behind her eyes, half relieved, half unsettled. She carried a clipboard tucked under her arm, but she hadn't written anything on it. Her weapon was holstered. Her voice was quiet. "I need to show you something." They followed her to the edge of the square, where the general store stood untouched. Its windows had been shuttered during the siege. The door, though unlocked, bore no sign of damage, and the porch remained strangely clean, as though no one had dared step too close. Inside, the shelves were stocked, too stocked. Luther's eyes scanned the inventory as if reading a battlefield. Boxes of radio batteries, water-purifying tablets, crates of freeze-dried meals still sealed, stacked neatly beside first aid kits and fuel canisters that had disappeared from emergency depots weeks ago. "I thought he was just hoarding," Claire muttered, trying to stay out of it. But Gladys moved past her, toward the rear office where a desk sat half open, its drawers filled with folded documents, old receipts, handwritten lists, names, addresses, scheduled patrols. And beneath it all, tucked between two manila folders, was a photo, grainy but clear, of Caleb and his men standing beside the store's loading dock, smiling beneath the overhang as they unloaded supplies. Esther picked it up and studied it without a word. Then came the voice from the back door, slow and drawn, as though carried by someone who had expected this day to come, but not so soon. "You shouldn't be here." They turned to see Mr. Porter, the old man who had run the general store since before the youngest veteran had graduated boot camp, standing with his hand resting on the doorframe, eyes narrowed behind thick glasses, the brim of his cap low over his forehead. Esther didn't speak first. Claire did. "Is this your handwriting?" Mr. Porter didn't look at the paper in her hand. His jaw tensed. "You don't understand," he said. "I was trying to preserve something. Not everyone wanted this place turned into a war zone." "No," Esther said quietly, finally stepping forward, the photo still in her hand. "You just wanted to choose who belonged in it." He didn't deny it. "You think this is your town?" His voice didn't rise, but it thickened with resentment. "You walk in, act like you own it, rile everyone up. You don't belong here. You never did. You're an invader." The word landed like a slap, and the quiet in the room grew heavy. Claire stepped between them, slowly, her hand brushing her holster, not out of fear, but as a reminder of the authority she still carried. "That's enough." She turned, unfastened the cuffs from her belt, and looked him in the eye. "You aided known domestic terrorists. You interfered with law enforcement. And you knowingly supplied weapons and logistics for a siege?" Mr. Porter didn't argue. He stood still as she read him his rights, his eyes never leaving Esther's face, even as she didn't meet his gaze. She wasn't interested in watching him fall. She had seen enough of that. Her focus was on something deeper, on the people standing just outside the door. Townsfolk who had once smiled politely at Mr. Porter, who had once let his quiet bitterness pass as tradition, who now stood with their arms crossed, their faces drawn, their silence no longer passive but shifting. Because this was no longer about choosing sides quietly. The battle had forced their hands. And in that moment, with the cuffs snapped into place and Mr. Porter led down the courthouse steps in full view of a town still trembling with dust and memory, something cracked open. Not loudly, but permanently. The air shifted. The line Buck had died to hold was no longer invisible. People began to speak, not in shouts, not in protest, but in action. A schoolteacher walked up to Claire and handed her a notebook filled with incidents she had never reported. A high schooler offered a flash drive with names of students who had attended Caleb's off-grid meetings. A mechanic, who had once turned his back when Esther entered his shop, crossed the street to help her pick up the boxes from her burned porch. The town was no longer uncertain. It was waking up. That night, while the embers still glowed faint in the remains of the siege, Luther set up camp inside the courthouse annex. He took over tactical planning with the precision of someone who had long stopped questioning why they were still needed, and simply accepted that leadership, in times like these, was not a title. It was a burden someone had to carry. Gladys, her arm now properly splinted and bandaged, volunteered to lead a second wave, not of attacks, but of information. She would walk the outer districts, check for remaining sympathizers, distribute radios, map recovery zones. She would carry Buck's playbook into places he would no longer see. And Esther? Esther said nothing that evening. She stood at the edge of her destroyed garden, looking not at the wreckage, but at the loose soil beneath it, the same dirt where collards once grew, where she used to kneel and plant seeds early in the spring. Her hands were still, her back upright, her breathing slow. When Gladys asked if she wanted help clearing it, she shook her head once and whispered only one word, "Not yet." Then, long after the others had turned in for the night, she walked away, alone. She didn't go far, only to the shed, the one place the fire hadn't touched. And as the moon lifted itself over the wounded rooftops of a town learning to breathe again, she opened the door, stepped inside, and descended back into the quiet beneath the earth, where it had all begun, where silence was not absence, but preparation. It began with a live stream. The image trembled from the grip of whoever held the phone, and the resolution blurred every corner of the frame like fogged glass, but it didn't matter. The message was meant to provoke, not to be pretty. Caleb stood in front of the diner beneath the old neon sign that still flickered in broken stutters from the damage it had suffered weeks ago. The colors behind him smeared against the early dusk, making the building look more like a tomb than a battleground, though he stood there as if reclaiming something sacred. His face, still mottled from bruises not yet healed and cuts that had been left to scab raw, appeared close to the screen as he took the phone from someone off camera and stared directly into the lens, his eyes filled with the brittle arrogance of someone who had not learned from being defeated, only learned to blame others for it. "You think you ran us off?" he said, each word deliberate and low, his voice straining to sound like a warning, though it trembled with desperation. "You think a handful of geriatrics and a few bleeding hearts mean this place belongs to you now? No. It's ours. We built it. We bled for it. We buried ours here. You want to act like we don't matter? Then you come and tear it out of our hands yourselves." Behind him, Red leaned on the counter inside, a crowbar gripped in his good hand, the other arm still bound in a sling. His stance was stiff, unnatural, like the pain hadn't faded, but pride wouldn't let him sit. Two other men paced behind the booth line, their faces half covered with bandanas, jackets smudged with ash and sweat, and movements full of coiled tension that betrayed how thinly their resolve had been stretched. The camera swung wide as Caleb stepped further inside, gesturing with a grand sweep of his arm, as if he were welcoming them all into a twisted theater, a place where hate could be staged as history and dominance reclaimed by performative rage. He turned to face the phone again, jaw tightening. "This is ours again. This is how it starts." And then the feed cut. But by the time that last sentence reached the ears of the town, it was already over, because Esther and the veterans were already inside. They had been there for hours, arriving one by one in silence, dressed without recognition, seated without pattern, moving with the stillness of people who understood not only how to wait, but how to let their enemies hang themselves with their own performance. No one watching the live stream could see the truth behind the camera. The cooks behind the kitchen door who were not cooks, the man wiping glasses behind the bar who had once led a six-man reconnaissance team through occupied territory, the woman setting napkins on tables whose hands had once dressed bullet wounds in the back of a transport truck. They were the roots beneath the surface, silent and woven together. Samir stood just beyond the pass-through window, apron tied clean over his jacket, his hands resting on the edge of the stove. His breath came slow, his left foot angled just right to pivot if needed. The skillet on the burner had been warming for 30 minutes, not for cooking, but for weight. Luther leaned behind the counter, towel slung over his shoulder, drying the same mug twice as he watched the mirror above the liquor shelf, his eyes catching each flicker of motion across the room. Gladys moved like shadow, steady between booths with a tray balanced in her right hand, her left wrapped beneath a folded coat. She didn't limp now, not because she no longer felt the ache, but because there was no room for softness tonight. Claire sat closest to the back door, legs crossed beneath the table, newspaper unfolded in front of her, the butt of her service weapon pressing against her ribs through her jacket. She had no plans to use it unless she had to, but she would, if she had to. And Esther was seated in the same booth where it had all begun, where Caleb had once leaned in too close and called her something he couldn't take back. Her tea sat untouched, her fingers rested lightly around the base of the cup. She hadn't spoken since she entered. She hadn't needed to. When the gang burst through the door, barking commands and shoving aside chairs like they were storming a fortress, no one moved. Caleb shouted something about control, about taking back what was his, and Red banged the crowbar against the register drawer. But no one flinched, no one panicked, because they were already surrounded. Luther was the first to act, moving like a lever springing loose. He stepped from behind the counter and launched the mug into the face of the man closest to him. It shattered against bone, sending the man reeling back with a scream. And in that same motion, Luther vaulted the counter, drove his knee into the man's stomach, and dragged him head first across the booth divider, dropping him with a thud that rattled the cutlery. From the kitchen, Samir came through the swinging door with the skillet gripped like a warhammer. Red turned, swinging the crowbar wildly, but Samir ducked, pivoted on the planted foot he'd prepared, and drove the flat of the iron pan into Red's ribs so hard it bent the handle. Red dropped the crowbar, gasping, and tried to swing again with his left, but Samir caught the arm mid-air, twisted, and brought him down across a chair, the wood snapping beneath both their weight. Gladys struck next. Her tray, solid steel beneath the cloth, cracked against another gang member's jaw. The blow, clean and fast. She stepped in, slammed her shoulder into his chest, and drove him back into the jukebox hard enough that the speakers sputtered to life with broken static. As he staggered, she swept his legs from beneath him, and when he hit the floor, she planted her boot square on his chest. Claire rose in tandem, flipping the table aside and leveling her weapon, not to fire, but to command. One of the men raised his hands, too late, and she kicked his legs from under him before straddling his back and yanking his wrists behind his spine. One of the men raised his hands, too late, and she kicked his legs from under him before straddling his back and yanking his wrists behind his spine. The cuffs clicked like punctuation. And finally, Esther stood. The chaos around her had already shifted the tide, but she moved slowly, deliberately, stepping down from the booth with the calm of someone who had been waiting for this moment, not for hours, but for years. She walked directly toward Caleb, who now looked around with wild, darting eyes, watching every one of his men fall like dominoes. His bravado faded in an instant as she approached. "You think this place belongs to you," she said, not as a question, but as a sentence handed down. And then she hit him. It was a single strike, tight, clean, drilled from muscle memory, forged through decades of restraint. Her fist connected with his jaw in a sharp arc that lifted him off balance, his legs stumbling beneath him as he careened backward into the same booth he had once claimed as his own. He didn't get up. Red groaned where he lay on the tile, pinned beneath Samir's weight. The others were cuffed or unconscious, their limbs twisted, their faces bloodied not from revenge, but from refusal. The live stream was over, but the town had already seen what mattered. And as Esther turned back toward her booth, lifted her tea, and looked out across the quieted diner, she understood that this wasn't about reclaiming one space. It was about never giving it up again. The arrests came swiftly, not in rage, not in retaliation, but in order. Claire moved through the diner with the calm authority of someone who no longer questioned whether she belonged in that badge. The remaining gang members were disarmed, cuffed, and read their rights beneath the same broken neon sign where they once thought fear would rule. Their weapons were logged, their bodies processed, their names added to lists that no longer disappeared into drawers. The moment was not triumphant. It was necessary. And beyond that moment, justice began to breathe again. With the last of the gang's visible presence dismantled, their hideouts collapsed under the weight of exposure. One was a cabin north of the rail line, barely furnished but filled with fuel drums, printed maps, and flagged targets. Another was tucked behind the old grain elevator, masked by rusted farm equipment and scrap metal. Inside, they found communications equipment, field notes, and messages that linked the group to extremist forums and known hate cells across the state. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was not what forced the next step. That came from the people. The town, once gripped by silence and politeness, now moved with its eyes open. Witnesses came forward, men and women who had stayed quiet for too long, who now brought phone recordings, receipts, photographs, names. They filled out sworn statements not because they had been asked, but because they were done carrying guilt that never belonged to them. And when federal agents arrived, quiet, focused, dressed in dark jackets with small gold letters on their backs, they found not just a file, but a community ready to speak, ready to heal. Claire stood beside them, translating the language of the town to the pages of official record. Her voice was steady, her testimony clear, and when the governor's office called to confirm her new title, she didn't smile or cry. She nodded once, then hung up the phone and walked back to work. The safe house beneath Esther's shed was no longer hidden. Its concrete steps, once dust-covered and lined with silence, were now swept clean. The walls had been painted, soft gray, not to forget what they were, but to make room for what they could become. The shelves that once held rusted weapons and faded maps now bore plaques with names, Bucks among them, and photos in black and white frames. It became a memorial and a classroom, a place where young people were brought to learn not how to fight, but how to hold the line before it ever needed defending. And though the town had changed, it had not forgotten. Pastor Elijah gathered them in the square 1 week after the siege, beneath the elm trees near the courthouse, where the air was still sharp with spring. They came with candles, with folded chairs, with children too young to understand what had been lost, but old enough to remember the faces of those who stood for them. There were no grand speeches, only quiet prayers. Names read aloud. Buck's voice played from an old cassette, recorded during a community meeting years ago. Laughter followed the static. And then, stillness. Esther stood near the back, her shawl wrapped tight, her eyes hidden behind dark glasses. When the candles were lit and the hymn began, she did not sing. She closed her eyes and let the warmth of the flames flicker against her face. That night, the square did not shine with vengeance or glory. It glowed with presence, with memory. 2 days later, she received a letter. The envelope was plain, postmarked from a rehabilitation center in Alabama. The handwriting was blocky, uncertain. Inside was a folded sheet. Short, handwritten, raw. Aunt Esther, I don't know what they taught me to hate. I only know you looked at me like I mattered, even after I'd tried to unmake you. I don't expect to be forgiven, but I wanted you to know I remember your voice, and I think I'm ready to start listening. Marcus. She held the letter in both hands and read it 3 times before placing it in the drawer beside her bed. She said nothing of it to the others, but she watered the azaleas later that afternoon, and she whispered his name as she did. And then came the quiet. No longer the quiet of fear or waiting, but the kind that follows long after the work has been done, when there is nothing left to defend but the soil beneath your feet. Fields that had once been marched through by armed men now rustled only with wind. Roads that once carried trucks filled with anger now bore mail carriers, bicycles, and laughter. The town had not been saved by the veterans. It had been reminded, by their courage, their patience, their refusal to give up, that it had always been worth saving. One morning, long after the investigations were done and the press had moved on, Esther walked to the edge of the field behind her house. The garden had begun to take root again. Rows marked with care, seeds pressed deep into the same ground that had once been trampled. Her coat lifted in the wind, the hem brushing against her boots. She stood still, eyes on the horizon, not looking for anything in particular, but letting herself feel the weight she had carried, and the fact that, for the first time in a long time, she was ready to set it down. The wind swept through the tall grass, brushing past her cheeks like a breath, and in that moment, she let herself grieve, she let herself breathe. And then she turned back toward the shed, toward the garden, toward the house they had not been able to burn to the ground, because her roots were deeper than they knew, and she was not done plantin'. Months passed, the kind of months that didn't shout their arrival, but settled in gently, like dew over rooftops, like new growth pushing through scorched soil. The town was different now. Not unscarred, but changed. Not simply safer, but aware. People still carried what they'd seen, what they'd chosen, but the difference now was that they carried it together. On the side of the diner, where the sun hit hardest just before noon, a mural had taken shape. It began with a simple brushstroke. A tree, tall and wide, its roots reaching toward the foundation, its branches stretching above the awning. Then came the figures. Esther, in the center, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes set not forward but slightly to the side, where the rest stood beside her. Buck, tall and unsmiling, one hand resting on his cane. Gladys, with a half-smile and her arm across Esther's shoulder. Luther, standing just behind, his posture straight as ever. Samir, leaning on a crutch, painted mid-laugh. The background bled into soft greens and oranges, the kind of colors that held memory without demanding sorrow. Children stood at its base during field trips, pointing out the faces they recognized. Teachers spoke softly as they led them past, not with lessons about war or conflict, but about standing up, about holding ground. about what it meant to stay when staying wasn't easy. The safe house beneath Esther's shed had been transformed. Gone were the old tarps and dust-caked tools. In their place were photographs, audio stations with recordings of oral histories, glass displays with artifacts from the town's darkest nights and brightest mornings. A bronze plaque hung at the entrance, for those who remembered what was worth protecting. Veterans from nearby counties came during summer weekends to speak. Men and women who had fought in places far from home but recognized the kind of fight Esther and her people had faced. They sat in folding chairs, passing around coffee and memory, sharing stories that once lived in silence. Children listened. Teenagers asked questions. The past had become something living, not just something endured. Behind Buck's old house, where wild grass had once reclaimed the land, the garden was blooming again. Esther knelt most mornings with her sleeves rolled up and her hands in the dirt, gently guiding sprouts of collards, tomatoes, and sunflowers toward the sky. Gladys worked beside her, humming under her breath, her movements slow but certain. They planted in rows, just like before. They watered by hand. They didn't speak often while working, but they didn't need to. Every seed they placed was a conversation in its own right. Samir had recovered mostly. He still walked with a limp, but there was strength behind it now, a pace that kept steady as he led Saturday self-defense classes in the school gym. Teenagers came in unsure, shoulders hunched, eyes darting, but they left with something behind their eyes: awareness, confidence, purpose. Samir didn't bark orders. He told stories while they trained. He reminded them why fear was a tool, not a sentence. And when they laughed, he laughed with them, limping from mat to mat, with the grace of a man who had nothing left to prove. Claire wore the sheriff's badge with quiet dignity. She didn't puff her chest or raise her voice unless it was needed. She walked the streets, stopped by the market, helped push stalled cars out of ditches, cited those who needed citing, and protected those who had stopped expecting protection. The law in town no longer arrived late. It no longer looked away, and it no longer picked sides. And one morning, just as the spring light slanted gold through the town square, Esther walked through the diner's front door once more. She moved with the same calm as before, her coat gathered around her shoulders, her scarf tucked against the breeze. The bell above the door chimed, soft and familiar, and no one froze. No one whispered. No one stared. The waitress, barely 20, with freckles across her nose and a bandana holding back her curls, came out from behind the counter and pulled Esther into a hug so natural, so genuine. It softened something that had been tight in her chest since the day this all began. At the counter, a boy no older than 10, with dirt on his shoes and a gap between his front teeth, tipped his cap without being told. He didn't know the whole story. He didn't need to. He knew enough. Esther nodded once and walked to the window booth. The same seat, the same view. The glass was clean now. The street outside quiet. Her reflection stared back at her, not younger, not lighter, but free in a way she had not expected. She folded her hands around the cup set before her and looked out over the town, not because it had changed for her, but because she had helped it remember how. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have hand-picked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.